All the phone is getting to be hot. So I stopped at Romans chapter 13, verse 8. So the day is April the 9th, 2023. The day is Sunday. Yeah, the phone getting hot. So let's go back to Romans chapter 13, verse 8. Romans chapter 6, verse 23. John chapter 3, verse 16. Peter 2, chapter 3, verse 9. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4. Acts chapter 13, verse 38. John chapter 14, verse 6. Revelation chapter 12, verse 12. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 18. Galatians chapter 5, verse 13. Corinthians 2, chapter 3, verse 6. Corinthians 1, chapter 6, verse 9. And Romans chapter 8, verse 27. And you got Ephesians chapter 1, verse 22 to 23. Corinthians 1, chapter 11, verse 3. Acts chapter 18, verse 1 to 28. Acts chapter 10, verse 1 to 48. Galatians chapter 3, verse 7. Galatians chapter 3, verse 1 to 29. Corinthians 2, chapter 9, verse 9 to 7. Corinthians 2, chapter 9, verse 8. Corinthians 2, chapter 8, verse 9. Corinthians 2, chapter 5, verse 10. Corinthians 1, chapter 15, verse 28. Corinthians 1, chapter 12, verse 1 to 14 and 40. Corinthians 1, chapter 5, verse 1 to 13. Corinthians 1, chapter 1, verse 1 to 2. Romans chapter 10, verse 9 to 10. Romans chapter 9, verse 1 to 33. Romans chapter 5, verse 8. Romans chapter 2, verse 14 to 15. Acts chapter 17, verse 11. Acts chapter 14, verse 27. Acts chapter 12, verse 12. Acts chapter 8, verse 1 to 40. Acts chapter 2, verse 1 to 47. John chapter 15, verse 26. And John chapter 8, verse 32. What did the Bible say about pimple gold? Well, I wrote some more. 28 Bible verses about pimple. King James Version. What did the Bible say? For God loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. For the waste of go to John chapter 3, verse 16, Romans chapter 6, verse 23, John chapter 14, verse 6, Matthew chapter 6, verse 24, Corinthians 1, chapter 11, verse 3, Corinthians 2, chapter 6, verse 14, Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4, Ephesians chapter 6, verse 8. We going somewhere. Then you got Corinthians 1, chapter 6, verse 9, Peter 2, chapter 3, verse 9, Timothy 1, chapter 6, verse 10, Timothy 1, chapter 2, verse 11 to 15, Corinthians 2, chapter 3, verse 6, Galatians chapter 5, verse 13, Romans chapter 13, verse 8, Galatians chapter 3, verse 7, Revelation chapter 12, verse 12, Corinthians 1, chapter 1, verse 2, Corinthians 2, chapter 9, verse 6 to 8, Ephesians chapter 1, verse 3, Corinthians 1, chapter 15, verse 28, Romans chapter 8, verse 27, Acts chapter 13, verse 38, Romans chapter 10, verse 9 to 10, Corinthians 2, chapter 8, verse 9, Corinthians 2, chapter 9, verse 7, Ephesians chapter 1, verse 22 to 23, and Corinthians 2, chapter 5, verse 10. We're talking about pimple gold. What is God's biggest sin? One, determined unforgiving sin, blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, also known as the sin unto death. It's specific and several purpose of the sworn gospel include Mark chapter 3, verse 28, 29, Matthew chapter 12, verse 31 and 32, and Luke chapter 12, verse 10, as the New Testament passage include Hebrews chapter 6, verse 46, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 20 to 31, and John 1, chapter 5, verse 16. Can a man bribe God? God does not need anything man has to offer. He gives because he loved us and wanted the best for his children. God is sovereign and will be only what is best. Remember, he cannot be blind. You can't prove God. Because a whole lot of people don't want to pay the tithe.